Hi, guys. It's your host, Sharian, and you're listening to The Wheel of Vessels. Wheel of Vessels family, we're back again, and I'm very, very happy to be with you to discuss another important topic within the series on race and Western Christianity. So, today we're going to be digging into the topic of when did Jesus become white and what effects it has had on essentially everybody. I think it's going to be a good topic for people to understand. And by the way, if you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to the first two episodes, I'd highly, highly advise doing that first because we actually debunked the myth that Jesus was white, and we furthermore broke down the biblical history, not of just black people, but of all people and their origins. And I believe it's important to start at the beginning so that you can chronicle how we've gotten here today. After the entire series is over, we'll have, gone from the Bible up until 2020 and beyond. And I thought it was just very important to make sure we went in order so people could really, understand how, things have turned out the way they are right now, how we've, sort of entered into the perfect storm of the climate we're currently in, how we got here. It seems like it came out of nowhere, but I promise you that it hasn't. It actually has a very rich history that's landed us here. And it goes much deeper than slavery. Slavery, of course, is a center focus of how, we've gotten to where we are. But there are many, many other reasons and ways that, have gotten us to where we are. And so this series is going to go in order chronologically to show you that broken down. We're going to hit so many different topics. You want to stay with it. Even on those days that you don't feel like hearing or talking about race, just because it's such an important topic to our country. It's not just limited to the religion of Christianity. It's something that we need to understand as a whole. So I welcome all ears, all people from all backgrounds to listen to this if they want to get a better understanding, and if they want to know how to go back, take these tools and help better their local communities. That is the point of this entire thing, is to contribute to the ending of racism. And if you're still on the fence about whether you really believe it exists or not, this is, to help you, give you the facts for you to sort of make that decision on your own. I always encourage people to have their own mind. Granted, I believe a lot of what I'm presenting, not even a lot, what I'm presenting is factual. It's not really emotional, though my opinion, which I always state on my episodes, will be in this. I will try to keep it biblical though, and I will try my best to stick to facts and, testimonies and stories of different people, as we go through this. So, I hope you welcome that. So by the time, you finished it with this in its entirety, I believe that you'll have the tools to eradicate, the hindrances that have abounded through racial and social constructs, as I explained before. I want to say now that I believe it's your job to take the torch and run with it. I believe that we must be really aggressive when it comes to what I feel is the principality of racism and white supremacy over our country. It's been aggressively fighting through political, religious, and systemic control to stay in power. Whether that's realized or not, this is something that is just the truth. Even people that don't believe in principalities or understand what that is, I believe can see that. And so if we do not do all that we can to fight against this sin with the same energy that's placed into things like pro-life, and other sins that are really important to certain groups, then we could likely reach a point of no return in this country. And those who were silent will end up on the wrong side of history, just as many of our ancestors who have fell on certain sides have, yet protected through scholarship their sins, and kept those things hidden. I don't believe this generation will be that lucky. It's a lot more open. We don't hide things as much. Everything's documented. I say be on the right side of history. And I'm going to explain as we go through this series what the right side of history is, but I can tell you now it is not pro racism. So, based on, the ground we laid in the past couple of episodes, we now have a foundation to stand on as we move forward beyond the Bible and more into the spread of the gospel over the next 295 years after AD, which by the way means after death or after the death of Jesus Christ, and BC is before the death of Jesus Christ. So we're going to break down a few important events and people such as the forefathers or fathers of Christianity and their contribution to the church, the spread of Christianity to Europe, the Council of Nicaea, Constantine and its relationship to Christianity, as well as the effects of whitewashing, the whitewashing of Christianity. Now, I know this might sound very historical and possibly even boring, but trust me, it isn't. You'll need this information to understand how white nationalism became a thing. I'll try to put everything as plain as I can, and digestible, easily digestible explanations so that even the young and those very uninterested in history can understand it. We have a lot to cover, but I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible with the information. So let's jump in. The reason that this episode is important is because we're answering the question of why so many people see color when they think of Jesus, when they think of God, and when they think of other biblical figures and Christianity as a whole. Digging into the literal root of the saying Christianity is the white man's religion, it's been incorrectly perceived this way because of unconscious bias that leads to, a disparity of perceived reality and verbal messages. The lack of representation is literally everywhere. It's not just in the church. Unconscious bias does not discriminate, and it affects everything. It seeps into everything from schools, our workplaces, churches, our communities. It's literally in everything. And what's funny about it is that most white folks, they feel when you discuss this that it's very divisive or divisive, but that is because being white is what's normal for them and for everybody. They don't really see how they influence, ways this of this country and the world. They don't think of whiteness in racial terms, but they see it as being more of a human being. But dare I say that the fact that it can even be seen as just being a human being, that implicitly sets the standard that being white is the default and everything else is the other. Any other culture or ethnicity outside of whiteness can describe their culture, they can describe their culture for you, how it's different from the norm, and the norm is usually always going to be factually whiteness. They're comparing it usually to whiteness as the norm and the default. This is, really no different when it comes to Christianity, unfortunately, as it has not only seeped deeply into religion, but I'd even challenge that this was born out of religion, even going back to Constantine. When you ask your average white person what they think white culture is, they usually can't tell you. And to me, that's proof that it's wrapped up in their conscious or unconscious supremacy. What is supremacy anyways? And, I know that word really sounds harsh. It has like such a stigma to it. And I'm sure nobody really wants to be associated with it. But I want to tell you now that you have to take yourself out of this before we proceed, because if not, this can easily feel, a bit offensive in the same way that, I feel, in the same way that we battle with other spirits like spirits and powers such as fear, depression, murder, whatever spirit, right? We have to understand, and what we usually do understand is that we are not that spirit itself. That we have to treat racism and white supremacy or white nationalism the same way we would treat a spirit of fear, so to say. Granted, I believe that this spirit is very much more dangerous than something like a spirit of fear. However, though spirit of fear can be very dangerous, but not in the same way, right? I'm not saying that they are equivocally the same. I'm more so saying that you have to see it in that way. The same way that you can be oppressed by a spirit of fear. Be fearful everywhere that you go. No one's going to look at you and say, you are fear, right? And they may say you are fearful. You're full of fear or whatever, right? And, we all have our prideful ways and where we don't want to be seen as being full of some negative thing. But we understand that fear is not us. Fear is not our character. It's not who we are. Dare I say that you should see racism and white supremacy the same way. Now, I'm not absolving people of being racist or something, but I'm saying most people in this country, they're born with a bias. They're born, or I should say they're born into an environment of prejudice and biasness and many times racism. You're born into a society that cultivates that. And so I what I'm saying is that, one, we can't help what we're born into. Can we change it? Yes, we have the power to. The same way you have the power to overcome a so-called spirit of fear, you have the power to overcome a spirit of racism, whether it be that you have a spirit of racism or that it's over your local community. We know for a fact that it's over our country. And it has been over our country for a very long time. And so, you're not at a loss for, how to fight this or where to fight this, because it's everywhere. Now, you, through self-observation, will have to decide if it's something that you hold inside of yourself, if it is something that you yourself need to cast out, get rid of, overcome, change your heart from. You have to decide that for yourself. And hopefully this series can help you really understand if you've had, that implicit bias, if you've had racism in your heart. Hopefully it can help you get to a place where you can overcome that. You can repent and help others do the same. But my point in saying this is that you are able to take yourself out of it and see this spirit as the enemy instead of taking it on as someone is attacking your character, or become defensive to go beyond, do whatever it takes to prove that you don't have this thing. Instead of focusing on that, just pay attention, listen. More than anything, I really ask that you listen. And then, as you're listening, if you find some similarities in what you're hearing and then your own personal attitudes, deal with it. Just deal with it. Don't make it a big thing in the sense that it's like, oh my God, you're saying I'm a racist or something like that. Just deal with it maturely and make a decision that you're not going to let it defeat you, and you don't want it to defeat others, and you want to rid it out of this country and get rid of that dark underbelly of America, right? And begin to turn this into the country that God really wanted it to be. And so, in my opinion. And so, I'm just saying, don't marry yourself to it. Don't, find yourself getting offensive, or getting defensive. You should question what's living inside of you, that you would tie yourself to such a spirit if you are. And now, if you're dealing with that spirit, which is common, by the way, and we know that it resides over the whole country, like I said, then it's really your job to repent. We know that we have to answer for everything. Racism does not get a pass. It doesn't get a pass for being common, or even for you believing it's imaginary or no big deal. You still deal with it because the same way with other sins, the reason a lot of times some people aren't aware of things is because they've deceived themselves. Racism is no different. I just don't want you to deceive yourself into thinking it's no big deal and it's in your heart, and think that because you thought it wasn't a big deal, that it's not a big deal to God. It still is, whether you recognize it or you don't. The same way that the worst sin in your eyes must be answered for, so must racism. And that isn't just reserved for the KKK. So again, I say, what is supremacy? Circling back there, right? It is the state or condition of being superior to all others in authority, power, or status. Now, um, something that white people are born in with is supremacy and privilege. Like I said earlier, you're born with that power, whether you acknowledge it or not. And I think another thing that should be defined here is whiteness or white culture. And the reason we can't really define it is because defining its difference is because it was really built to be the superior standard, the culture and way of life for all. And the difference from it has long been perceived as a threat or a minority or lower than. When white Christians tell us there's no difference between white and black, we don't see race. There's only the human race. That negates the fact that we're different and our lives are very different. God separated the people to go out, and build nations as different people, as different nationalities. And that was a beautiful thing to him. See Tower of Babel in the last episode to get a better understanding of that. That is where nations began. So overall, God never desired for us to be the same and live the same or even worship him the same. Difference is beautiful. It isn't an evil thing. Nationalities and their differences are lovely, and God meant it to be that way. But what is not good is for one to set out to assimilate to others and for all of us to be the same. Who set the standard to do things the European way across the entire world? Because I will say right now, it definitely wasn't God. It wasn't him. However, race and the origins of its creation, plus what it was used for, is inherently evil. Now, you may be saying, Sharon, I think you're a racist and this is rubbing me the wrong way. And I'm feeling really uneasy, like in my spirit. So, maybe I should stop listening to this. I will tell you, I'm sorry for that voice, but I'm just saying, I actually say it like this, just like one of my favorite pastors, Pastor Jerome Gay says. He said, I'm not a racist, but I am responding to racist. So when you try to whitewash and sanitize parts of our history that reveal total depravity, then we should be called out on that. So to try to label someone as a racist because they decided to talk about something that happened. No, I'm not racist. You're a race evader because it makes you uncomfortable to confront the effects of white supremacy and the past of white supremacy. Love Jerome Gay. He says things he just wraps that thing on up. That's exactly what it is that I'm trying to say. This isn't a black thing. This isn't a white thing. This is a human thing. It's an Imago Dei thing because we are made in his image. Couldn't have said that better. I feel our country is due on overthrowing this principality. We've allowed this thing to reign for long enough. It is not you. This principality is not you. It's not who God made you to be. Whether you agree or not, or think it is something that you embrace or not, is so deeply embedded in our system, our society, and the people, that we've allowed it to become a part of personalities and personality traits. And like I said, this goes much deeper than like a KKK, which I feel, granted, I will not say that it's rare. It's much more common for people to participate in that than you think it is. There are lots of leaders, lots of official leaders that are in it, that are involved in KKK, but I won't go there. That's another episode. But essentially, I'm saying that we're past due on overthrowing this principality. We've allowed it to hold its power for long enough. It's really fueled by a spirit of fear and greed and power. And we need to put it to bed, because I'd say to a person that is dealing with that and doesn't want to let go of that power, don't you trust in God for real and all he has for you? Or are you afraid are you afraid enough that you continue to oppress another group to stay in power, you know, and be veiled behind religion, or be veiled behind some sort of fake deceptive ideology to keep that because, is it right? Is it really right? So I think Christianity being the white man's religion has overall really hurt us and turned many people off to the gospel that may have been otherwise interested in it. And nothing rings more true to Americans and even some other parts of the world now than white Jesus because of history, slavery, colonization, evangelical systems in the US, the climate, who we politically are supporting, evangelical support of Trump, and white silence in evangelical churches, but their loudness when it comes to anti-Black Lives Matter conversations. That silence when it comes to racism, but loudness when it comes to Black Lives Matter conversations is a really big one right now at this second. And, I'll touch on what's wrong with that in a future episode. But before you go on assuming, I said this in maybe like 2 episodes now. Before you go on assuming that I'm a supporter of BLM, I will tell you now that I am not. And I haven't been since they've launched, even during the Trayvon Martin case. I have not been a part of BLM. I'll explain why in a later episode that I am not a supporter of BLM, but I want to stay on topic, so I'll keep that for another episode. But I believe the white man religion thing is so heavy at this point that it's causing a huge falling away, not just of Black people, but of many young white people as well that were evangelicals. They've now walked away. People that were unchurched are making the decision that they don't want to ever be churched. They don't ever want to be Christian because of what they're seeing and the hypocrisy in what they're seeing. I want to talk about eventually why that feels hypocritical. I really plan on doing a really exhaustive breakdown of why. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it before or after the election. I'm not sure. It depends because there's a lot that goes into that and I need the time to really, I don't want to rush it. And we only have like a little bit of time before the election. As I'm dropping this on October 20th, 21st. So, not sure if I'm going to discuss it before or after, but we do know that, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention, it's the largest Protestant denomination, yet they had the largest decline in over a century this year. Multitudes have left citing it being due to hypocrisy, racism, injustice, white silence, many, many different reasons. But the racism thing was a big deal. They're struggling to find Christ in it, and they are not all wrong, as people would like to think, and as many have been saying, oh, they're just heathens and, they just want to live a life of sin and they just want to party, or they're not really about this Christian life and, blah, blah, blah. All the things that people have to say about them, they're not all wrong. When people see things like this, it makes them not want Christ. It's unfortunate. But that's what it does, especially when people don't know Christ for themselves personally, or it can even make them turn to a false doctrine like progressive Christianity, which I've seen. Oh my God, there's a huge percentage of people leaving evangelical churches and turning toward progressive Christianity, which is a very false doctrine, but they're doing it because they saw a lack of grace and compassion in the evangelical churches. And so they leave and they go and look for that grace and that mercy and that compassion, but then they find it in perversion of doctrine and heresy. And so, it's, man, this thing is real. It's so dangerous. This racism, this spirit of racism. And so, I like I said, they just can't seem to find Christ in it. And I think the church really needs to be more self-reflective on why people feel this way, instead of saying, well, Jesus was rejected, or calling them pawns or saying they're wrong, we need to reflect on our actions and what all of this has done to our nation. I can't tell you how many stories I've seen just this year alone of people who have walked away from Christianity because of this. People from all backgrounds, um, many different types of people, they have come to decide that this is the white man's religion and that it's a problem. And it's repellent to the world of others that God created to be different, not all the same under the umbrella of whiteness, and is hurting the gospel. Black people and many other groups are having a hard time seeing Christ as well, learning about Christ, or even wanting anything to do with white Jesus because of this narrative that, they feel have been shoved down their throats. And I know that sounds harsh, but I need you to see the levels in which they've been forced to absorb this information. They were on the fringe of struggling to embrace it like all along. But recently, for some of them, they found the behavior of, the evangelical church to be, at the very least, offensive, and at the most abhorrent, hypocritical, Pharisee, repulsive, and not reflective of Christ at all. And this is why the root of this narrative must be explained and exposed, because God is being painted in a light that's not true. He didn't ask for it. It's not his nature. It's not his will. It's not his word. And it's caused major sins against people, against the poor, against the widow, against the fatherless, against nations of people that have, and this has been done in his name. It has caused so much of creation to turn on him. So Christians cannot just sit and say no. It is solely their own sin that has caused them to turn from God. That's not true. It's not only, quote unquote, their sin. It is the pain of supremacy that has caused many of them to turn from God. And, I feel that until we face that and admit that, we cannot move forward. It doesn't matter how many times your local white pastor shouts from the rooftops that BLM is a terrorist organization and Marxist and socialist and they're ruining our country. I'm not laughing at that because I don't believe it or agree with it at all. But, another episode. But it doesn't matter how much, you preach on reconciliation. You won't reach anybody except for other white people that are already aligned to these ideologies, especially not black people, except your token blacks that desperately want the acceptance of evangelicals, or even are jaded through their past situations, or desire to come up in the world and be adopted into whiteness, which requires them to leave their blackness behind. Many times, a lot of token black conservatives fall in these buckets. Now, again, let me say this too. I'm not trying to put conservative and white in one bucket and black and liberal in another, but it just so happens to often fall that way. And I'll be able to prove it, and I'll be able to break that down in a future episode, but that's not for today. But, I know you may be thinking, well, you're causing divisiveness and you're pushing this racial narrative. But dare I say that America has forced race upon us all and set value and difference through skin color, and then uses those differences of skin color to create hierarchies. And white people have been valued above all others for hundreds of years. This is a fact. This can be traced point blankly, through history since 1619 up until today, not till just like 1950s or 60s. No, up until today. And so, this was forced on people. This hierarchy of race on American was forced through laws and culture, social constructs, and used to build our nation and enslave, and used to oppress through systemic racism, and seeped into every area of living, So to deny it exists and yell at black folks to forget they're black while they continue as white folks to set whiteness as the standard and the default race is wrong. This is just not how it works, people. Race is a construct that black people are forced to live with and within every day. Their very identities were born out of it and chained to it. How can one separate from something they're chained to? How can we end the system of race if we keep denying it? How can we tear down this system of sin, if we keep trying to skip over it and talk about skip over talking about it and educating and absorbing it. We have to destroy it by first understanding it, understanding its roots, how it works, and then accept the facts that we can work on destroying the principalities behind it after that. And if I'm honest, the greater majority doesn't want this to end. And what does the enemy Satan do the best? He focuses on convincing people that he doesn't exist so that you won't cast him out. Did I lie? I didn't lie. That's what he does. And within his kingdom just so happens to be a spirit of white supremacy, which operates as its leader does, follows after its leader. It learned from the best by minimizing and hiding itself in plain sight, pretending and denying its own existence while thriving. I mean, thriving through generation after generation. And its favorite pastime, might I add, is the church. So, if you walk into this in your feelings and on the defense with your walls up and your heart hardened and your ears shut, you will essentially be guilty of supporting this system implicitly, this system of sin. And if deep down you don't want to give up that power, just remember, when you die, you will have to answer to Christ for that. Even if it's, bigger than you and it's an entire system, you contributed to it. And so through this series, want to make people aware that, this is a major problem, and being silent about it is supporting it. And, God sees that heart. He sees that heart and all that's in it through the deception, whether you realize it or you don't. What you embraced, what you enabled, what you accepted, what you helped, what you championed, what you were silent about, what you turned a blind eye to, what he sees that. He sees that you rather go over to China, to help those communities and skipped right over your inner city in Detroit. He sees that. He sees it. You don't think that's a problem, but that's a problem. We have to answer for those things. So back to what I was saying. My point is that sin, this sin, just like every other sin, is an enemy of God. No one gets over on God. He takes oppression and injustice very seriously. It's mentioned much more than the sins you believe is the most important. It's important to him. He believes in pro-life too, comprehensively, as a whole, after the womb. He believes in it too. So no matter how we take it and we look at it, we first have to go back to where those chains began and when they begin to form, even before slavery. And hopefully we'll begin the process of working towards its destruction and the destruction of this myth. So let's recap really quick. The last episode, just very, very quickly. We discussed how using images of Jesus and other biblical figures was avoided because it was seen as idolatrous. We went over scriptures that supported that. We broke that down quite a bit. We also debunked the myth that, only white Europeans, were in the Bible, and that, Jews are not white people. Jews were very much a mixture of different races, very, very mixed up. They mixed a lot with Africans, and we discussed that. Now today, we're going to debunk the myth that only white Europeans contributed to Christianity and the scholarship of Christianity. The forefathers of Christianity were actually majority of Asian or Asiatic and African or Afro-Asiatic people. And keep in mind, when I said Asian or Asiatic, the Middle East is included in that. And so in order to understand Christianity versus Western Christianity, we really have to go back to those roots. And let's start with the fact that Christianity emerged in Palestine. It that is connected to Africa and Asia. It's the centerpiece between the two continents, and it was considered Northeast Africa for a while. And I think we discussed that on the Blacks in the Bible episode, but we now know that many of the major biblical characters spent a lot of time in Africa. They blended in, they mixed in, they even married Africans, factually. And even Jesus himself spent time in Africa. We, now know that through many movies and visual arts that Egypt has been viewed through a very white lens, but that is not accurate also. And it is African and historically black. By the way, Dr. Trevor O'Reggio, the professor of church history, explained it best when he said the intellectual platform of Christianity was being established in Africa, but it was moving west and north. The university system was established in Africa also, but also eventually moved west and north. He goes on to state Judaism preceded Christianity, and Africa already had a long-standing relationship with Judaism through earlier contacts with Abraham, Joseph, Queen of Sheba, and much more. Plus, the Hebrews spent 430 years in Africa, which is a lot of time. The Ethiopian eunuch from the book of Acts founded the Coptic church, and that was well established. Many diaspora Jews were in Africa. Philo the Great was a Jewish philosopher. He was in Alexandria, Egypt. So we know Christianity was developed in Africa because it followed where dispersed Jews were, and many were in Africa. I just wanted to throw that quote in there really quickly before I went on, because it's really, really good information. So when we look at the earliest theologians and the development of the early church, we can confirm that Christianity began as an African and Asian religion. The first 300 years of Christianity had its roots and foundation in the continent of Africa itself. The greatest center of early Christianity was an African city named Alexandria. It was located in Egypt. I just mentioned that from the quote. The earliest church theologians were African, and it included Athanasius, Tertullian, Origen, Augustine, much more, so many different African fathers. Augustine, for example, was a bishop of Hippo from 396 to 430 AD. He is considered to be the most impactful Christian mind after the Apostle Paul, just so you know, which is a pretty big statement. He didn't begin as Christian, though. He was a little wild in his day. He was actually a a teen father. He was a teen dad. He practiced also a Gnostic religion that focused on good and evil forces. It was not Christian. And then he moved to Milan, where he converted to Christianity. He helped shape the Christian doctrine and the church as we know it today. His confessions that he wrote was his first autobiographical writing. Get the word right, Cher. Of its kind. And Augustine also wrote substantial writings on the Trinity and on the relationship between the church and state. And these writings actually still influence, Christianity and Catholicism today. So if you look up Augustine, you will see all white images of him, yet under his description, the first thing it says is he was from Africa. That's always really funny when I see that. It's so common. But we see, that the first 300 years of Christianity had its roots in the continent of Africa itself. We also have Athanasius, who was born in Egypt, Alexandria also, which, by the way, was a very wealthy area. It's known as having been the epicenter of education. Now, Athanasius, he was pagan until he was converted. He had the nickname of Black Dwarf, which was given to him by his enemies. He was known to be short and dark-skinned. He spent 17 of his 45 years serving as a bishop of Alexandria while in exile. And, excuse me, his writings helped shape the church, and he was known for challenging the heretical doctrine of Arianism. So when we see, what we see here is that in 325 AD, that there were Black people arguing for the faith. Athanasius in particular went to the Council of Nicaea That was convened by the Emperor Constantine to resolve the controversy of Arianism, a doctrine that held that Christ was not divine, but that he was some being that was like God, but not God. The council deemed Arianism actually as a heresy, and it enshrined the divinity of Christ by invoking the term of one substance in a statement of faith known as the Creed of Nicaea. Constantine viewed conflict within the early Christian church as a tool of Satan and saw it as his duty to heal these schisms whenever they appeared. He saw Arianism as a heresy and as some sort of like trivial disagreement between academics who had too much time on their hands. But he was mistaken. It ended up being a much bigger deal than that. And I want to pause here because a lot of Hebrew Israelites, which is considered a heretical doctrine among Christians, um, they actually say this is where Christianity was created, but that is actually incorrect. The councils were a bunch of bishops that got together and they were trying to decide on certain things in relation to things that were already existent in the church. Constantine did not invent Christianity. As a matter of fact, we know that in the Bible, the word Christian is there. It was invented in the Bible. So, which is way before the Council of Nicaea has taken place. So, this means it already existed before Nicaea, and actually, Pastor Jerome Gay talks about this. I'd greatly encourage you to check him out if you want to learn more about this subject. He's studied it a lot, very educated in it, and yeah, so check that out. So I just wanted to make that statement because this is often a misunderstanding, and I didn't want to fuel that fire. So that's why I decided to go ahead and say that here. So, during this time, Christianity was considered like the most persecuted religion, as it always really has been. And we see that over 1,000 years before the Middle Passage, there were Black Christians fighting for Christianity. If it was not for Athanasius, there would be many in the false doctrine of Arianism, likely even till today. The Trinity and the divinity of Jesus was something that was formulated in Africa by Athanasius as well. We see that the rich history of Africa and its progressing Christianity was here, but unfortunately it was whitewashing. It was denied by people like Adolf von Harnack, who, by the way, removed all African contributions to Christianity and then whitewashed Christianity scholarship, which was a really big deal. Again, Jerome Gay talks a lot about that as well as the book How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind by Thomas C. Oden. Highly recommend reading that book. Very good book. So when did Christianity become westernized? Well, that began when Constantine came on the scene. Constantine was the emperor of Rome who ruled early in the 4th century. He was converted to Christianity, and he became the first Christian emperor. And we saw the empire begin to become a Christian state after it was legalized, and it spread throughout the Roman Empire. He not only initiated the evolution of the empire into a Christian state, but also provided the impulse for a distinctively Christian culture that prepared the way for the growth of Western medieval culture. It's important to note that Western Christianity was a branch of Christianity, but that he put it in the control of the Bishop of Rome. And, with his conversion, Christianity was free to come out of hiding. And more than that, with a Christian emperor and an extremely devout queen mother being Christian, it was suddenly like the new path to power and influence in an economy that used to be ran strictly on sucking up to like wealthy folks. Does that sound a little familiar? I think it does. As Christianity was taken over by the Bishop of Rome, there was another branch of Christianity in the East, in the South, which was thriving, which was in Africa, right, in the Middle East. But what ended up happening, and which is very important to note here, which is really unfortunate, is that as it was going on the rise, Christianity, this branch of Christianity was growing and on the rise in the West, in Africa and in Asia. Islam began to be on the rise very, very strongly. And over time, it just began to overtake these places of these countries that were primarily Christian. That included Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, Sudan. These all became Islamic countries. And over time, what Islam did was that, it took over the great Christian monasteries, the libraries, the churches, and it turned them into like these Islamic institutions, and all the work that was done by the African fathers and, these countries to progress Christianity, it just ended up being destroyed. And there was a really, really rich history that was lost at Carthage and Alexandria libraries because of the influence of Islam. And so it got pushed out, and Christianity just rose in like Western Rome, and that's still sort of the influence and the branch, the primary branch to that sort of we all know of today. So, but what's interesting about that is that, the great scholars that we discussed, they didn't come from Rome. They hailed from from the East or Africa. So Rome was not like a place of scholarship or theological intellectualism. It was a space, where Christianity did become dominant in the region, though. So when people think about Christianity, they don't think of it in its early form that was in Africa or Asia, but they think of it of the branch that was in the West. And that sort of like became the standard. Over the years, the Western branch emerged and began to suppress all other varieties of Christianity, which I found to be really, really unfortunate and sad, but it's a part of the facts. And so for the next 1,000 years, Western Christianity was dominated by white Europeans. And it's important to note that this branch did begin to adopt a lot of pagan practices and symbolism into Christianity. The religion changed greatly and it became fully immersed at some points in pagan practices and traditions. Constantine was raised as a pagan, so it really began with him, and he had a terrible tendency of blending it with Christianity. For example, he thought the sun and God were two views of the same supreme deity. March 7th AD 321, Constantine declared, on the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and the people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. So the Sabbath went from Saturday to Sunday, as the Sabbath day observance. And that was later canonized by the Council of Laodicea in AD 363. It was also Constantine who gave the stamp of approval for all the transformation that took place between the 1st and 4th century. He set the stage for all the fake, faux, whatever Christian practices you see emanating from Rome today. Forgive me for saying whatever. But here we see that Christianity, unfortunately, did not destroy paganism. It actually adopted it. And this was the beginning of perversion when it came to Western Christianity, and also the whitewashing of Christianity as well. The changing of scriptures to justify sin and so forth. It's all starting here, guys. So, go back, do your research, learn more about the specifics, because I'm not going to go in depth with those specifics. There's a lot of information there. But the Catholic Church and some Protestant churches practiced and observe religious events that are not found in the Bible. And it was Constantine and the steady adoption of pagan idolatry that was the source of this. It's argued that Constantine becoming Christian was a political move also for control and power over the masses, as they were, becoming, the more they were persecuted, the more they actually grew. It is said that Constantine became Christian to take over the faith and to point it towards paganism. Now, whether this is a true, conversion that he had, or it was used to point to like paganism, this is really, really heavily debated till today. So I'd say, go study that, for yourself, come to your own conclusions. But I did find that information to be very, very interesting. So around 1054, there was a schism between what we call Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. During that first millennium, it began, and Western Christianity emerged and became the primary voice of Christianity, and all other varieties of Christianity that did not conform to this branch were to be exterminated. And this is why today, in Western theology, we don't say this is Swiss theology or this is Thurman geology or American. Americans and Europeans centralized it by calling it theology, period. And when any other group contributed to that theology, whether that be African theology, women's theology, liberation theology, all of these were considered to be on the fringe, like, or peripheral of Western theology. Soong Cha Ra, the associate professor of church growth and evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary, stated, "We've created an otherness by saying you are not the norm. They cause others to assimilate to how they do things and their brand, and everything else is wrong or not the norm. It is seen as bringing good and Western theology to a world that doesn't know any better. They say we're going to go to Africa or Asia and fix their theology for them. That assumption of that superiority of one culture, people group over another is much more common than we realize. If you aren't willing to submit to the leadership from a local leader, an indigenous leader, a leader of color, then you're not actually coming to do ministry. You're going to be manifesting colonization." That last part was stated by Dominique Gillard in the documentary White Savior, which I strongly encourage people to watch. I didn't agree with the entire documentary, but I did agree with maybe like 90% of it. It was very, very, very enlightening and good. So I recommend watching that also. Juan Pablo Herrera from the same documentary discussed his experience with missions being worked in communities of color. He stated, "White churches with money would come in and assume there wasn't Jesus here until they came, but he would state Jesus was already there and working through many of them doing the work, but they would assume there wasn't until they came. It's important to realize that this white savior system is doing a lot more harm and not much good." So, like I said, I encourage you to watch the documentary. I wanted to throw that in there because, that decision that this is theology and everything else is not, and doing church any differently than this is wrong. It was established way back in that time. And look, it's still heavily the way of doing things now. And so we'll actually talk about that in the next episode when we finally start touching on transatlantic slave trade. I probably won't go into slavery on the next episode. Because the transatlantic slave trade is a lot to unpack. And so we're going to unpack that first and then we'll move on to slavery. But in that, we'll talk a lot more about this feeling like you have to go in and civilize a group of people that do things differently than you. It's funny because a lot of people assume that Africans were not Christian when they came in, but there actually were a lot of those Africans actually were already Christian when they came in, and it's always been assumed that they were not Christian at all. They were just some heathens that needed to be given the gospel, and then the same gospel was used to oppress them. And this is really got to be talked about. And so, we're going to discuss that on the next episode. So I hope you tune in for that. But back to what I was saying. I really, really love that documentary that I just mentioned. And I felt that it really related to where this idea of Western, this branch of theology being sort of like stamped as the theology and the only important theology. So I wanted to just sort of show the starting place and then where we've gotten to today. So I had been thinking greatly about that before I even watched the documentary, of how many evangelical churches like create sermons and videos and their own documentaries about how doing things like dancing in church is wrong. No, that is not how you do church. But to demonize it and accuse others of lacking sound doctrine because they've interpreted differently than you is an example to me of white supremacy at work. It's caused a lot of Black people to walk away from their churches and go to white evangelical churches because they taught them that their churches had bad doctrine. Oh man, that's an episode all by itself. A lot of Black churches have lost a ton of membership. I mean, people have just left by the masses to go to white evangelical churches because white pastors taught everywhere that no matter who the black church is, who's over that black church, regardless of if he went to seminary or not, none of it matters. They've got bad doctrine. Man, that has really hurt the black church. And so in a future episode, that's why we have a whole year. We're going to be breaking that down also. I have it in my schedule. So, I thought that was just so wow when I first really learned about that fact. And what they used to steer much of their theology were, based on what slave owners said. And they justified that by saying, black people weren't even humans and didn't have souls, you know? And so in response, I say, who died and made your branch of God the standard? The diversity of Christian voices, leaders, churches across the world serve to remind us that the Word of God carries a core message of inclusion and diversity of nations and ethnicities, and it can't be limited to one culture of expression, period. God makes people groups different. If you think He did not realize that this would bring a difference in expression and interpretation, you're sadly mistaken. It's a beautiful thing. I'm not promoting heresy. I'm definitely not promoting heresy, but for one branch to determine how all churches should operate and express their faith is wrong, especially when founded upon Western Christianity, which embraced so much white supremacy that it's the biggest sin of our entire nation. It's like the dark underbelly of this country, and it's still veiled as the greatest theology of Christianity to ever be, and that is just not true. It's problematic, to say the least. I might swing back to this topic later, but I want to jump into when the actual images of whitewashing began. So Jesus was not visually depicted until the 2nd century because Christians, they did not hold a positive position in Roman society until the 4th century. So until then, Jesus was depicted symbolically with the Jesus fish. I'm sure you've seen that drawing of the Jesus fish. It's like a line drawing. I think it's also called ichthus. I don't want to just chop up the name. I probably already have, but I don't know how to pronounce the official name, so I just call it the Jesus fish. But it used to help Christians find each other in their places of worship. The earliest images of Jesus Christ emerged in the 1st through the 3rd centuries AD among concerns of idolatry. They were less about capturing like the real appearance of Christ than they were about clarifying his role as like the ruler or as savior. And positive depictions of Jesus date from around 3rd century, and Jesus being shown as a good shepherd. And this is, I think, the oldest surviving attempt of representing him. And he was clearly depicted as a Roman of Italian or Greek descent. He was given olive skin, straight hair. He was shown without a beard, which is weird because this is common with Romans, but it's completely unheard of for Judean men to be without a beard. So previous to this, Jesus had always been depicted as an abstract symbol or combination of letters everywhere, no matter where you were at. This is how he was depicted. So once Christianity was legal, the artists began to go crazy. They started painting Jesus a lot. They went completely wild with it. And you see some images like a fresco of Jesus during the age of Constantine. This image actually belonged to Constantine himself, and it was painted by a well-regarded, connected artist. And then at this point, these pictures began to crop up all over the empire around this time. So it was generally accepted that his appearance, Jesus' appearance, was white during the reign of Constantine. And it really didn't change for like 18 centuries after that. And so this ended up sort of being the permanent look of Jesus. It evolved just a little bit, but when you compare it, I mean, it really goes all the way up until like, Warner Salmon's famous pictures of Jesus, which I'd argue are the most recognized paintings of Jesus up until today. I mean, these are if you put in Warner Salmon Jesus paintings or even paintings, the first things are going to come up are these white Jesus paintings, which we saw everywhere in all the churches. I mean, everywhere. And so it really never changed from Constantine all the way up until like a Warner Salmon. Um, it just sort of, created like this long tradition of white Europeans creating and disseminating pictures of Christ made in their own image. So we noticed that around the Middle Ages, in the middle of that point, that Westerners began to depict light versus dark skin in their religious images. When they showed lighter skin, it began to be used as a metaphor of purity, and good and things like that. And then when you would see darker skin, it represented evil and sinfulness. And it began to be also associated with foreigners and difference from being white. And so that's when we start to see that difference happen, you know. Um, we begin to see it also serving their own interests, and that is what led to the transatlantic slave trade and the justification of it. Um, White Jesus was used to support the system of slavery, white superiority and black inferiority. And most clergymen during the founding of America and onward were the ones writing about the inferiority of Africans. For example, A Scriptural View of the Moral Relations of African Slavery by David Award in 1849. They felt it was the responsibility of the white race to civilize pagan nations, like I explained earlier. And a part of that process was employing iconography, symbols, metaphors, and images that could corroborate and support this symbol of slavery and segregation. And so that is how Jesus became white. So, I encourage you not to stop here, but to keep on studying this and learning more about it so that, you can combat this. It's important to change these things when we see it, because it is wrong, and it was born out of something that was wrong, and there's no way to make that right. When something's born out of something that's wrong, you don't try to bless the mess. You don't try to bless it. You fix it. You fix it. And we need to fix it. So when we're silent and we, you know, say nothing, we're complicit, and it does affect others. It affects their self-esteem. We've seen that in many studies of children seeing constant white images and, authoritative images being white only. And we see how that's affected their self-esteem, affected their identities, and is communicated that, they're lower than through these different cues. So we have to challenge publishers of these artworks to take these things down, because it's an assassination on the identity of anyone else who's not white. When you ask a child what color is Jesus or God, they'll still tell you he's white to this day. You ask a 3-year-old what color is Jesus, they say white. White. It's been hammered into us. And when something's a part of supremacy, you need to challenge that. So getting defensive and wanting to keep it the same, I say, ask yourself, why are you fighting so bad to keep this the same? We really shouldn't be, constantly placing him in some sort of image anyways, because he straight up said not to do it. Now, I'm not saying not to ever have entertainment or something around that, but if you're going to do it, at least make it factual and reflective of the world. Right. Because that stuff is powerful. Art is one of the most powerful means to get people to look at stuff. It's powerful. For nearly 1,000 years, Western culture, Christianity has influenced and controlled and whitewashed as white by whites. Jonathan Edwards, who was a monumental theologian, revivalist, and a foundational figure in American evangelical, he was also a slave owner, but he's considered the greatest theologian in American history. They say he is the greatest thinker in Western history. And he's the poster child, but he's a slave owner. He was a slave owner. But I always find that interesting, because Black people are not allowed, in case, I don't know if you know, but Black people in evangelical circles are not allowed to celebrate MLK because they've marked him as a Marxist. But theological seminaries are riddled with slave owning and slave justifying theologians. Something's very wrong with this picture. Anytime a Black person comes to power to come up against, something and hold a different opinion than they do, then you get labeled all kinds of terrorists and all kinds of other things. But we don't ever say anything bad or hold accountable the theologians that they put on this pedestal, who were they were in heresy. Let's call it what it is. White supremacy is what is wrong with this picture. So I think Gary V. Simpson said this best, because I know people are probably like, God, I'm sick of this discussion on race already. But, in a world that privileges whiteness, we cannot say race does not matter. Race will always matter as long as race is considered to be a prominent, dominant, worthy, righteous, holy, and Christian thing. We don't know what Jesus looked like, but we know what he acted like. Well said, Pastor Simpson. I know for myself, this helps me determine which churches are simply hidden behind the veil of white supremacy and which are truly reflective of the gospel of Christ. I hate to say it, but I feel the majority are veiled. To go on, Dr. Soong Cha Ragan, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. He said this quote: "The way that white folks do things, do church, think, write, preach, talk about God is better than anyone else. That is white supremacy. When you walk into theological seminaries, Christian colleges, evangelical churches, denominational headquarters across the country, and you look at the people they highlight, study, put on their walls, they're all white men. It says that for the history of this denomination or this college or university, they believe the only important people are all white men, and it affirms white superiority." To that, I say, well said. And I want to leave off with this as we're already getting over on time. Man, I so easily go into an hour. Gosh. I kind of want to save some of the conversation I was going to have in this episode for another episode, but I do want to say this, that seeing white only images when it comes to biblical figures, and when it comes to spirituality, when it really comes to everything, but we're going to stick to the subject of Christianity. Seeing them only painted in whiteface, was a method of oppression. It helped strip the identities of Black people, without apology. The evidence of their historical influence on the earth has been wiped out. The evidence of it has been wiped out. It's just not fair, and we wonder why there are these issues in the Black community, but their self-image has constantly been defaced every day in history on their TV screens, bad characters spoken over their daily existence, and there's no identity to identify with. There's no deep family pride in history that's passed down or inherited for that matter. And so, I think this is something that we have to think about, because Malcolm X, who's another person that has been completely, ridiculed by evangelical culture, but I'll talk about that in a future episode too. He said he had a lot of great things about him. He did a lot of great things. He said a lot of great things. He had a lot of great logic and knowledge. And one of the great things that he said is, just as a tree without roots is dead, a people without history or cultural roots become a dead people. Unlike white Americans who can trace their ancestry through genealogical records, whose white European history is replete with, Irish songs and folk tales and Italian food and family traditions and Greek dances and wedding rituals, the African American history is largely a blank slate. And I believe it's time to redeem that history, bring it forth, discuss the truth, and help bring identity where we can. Thank God there's identity in Christ, but a lot of what we're seeing today is based in the fact that the identity has been wiped away. You have no idea how much that affects a people. Not only has the identity been wiped away, it's been completely replaced with white identity, who are largely the people that oppress them and erase their history in the first place. You can't imagine how painful that is for an entire people group to live with every single day, and how it affects them and their mental every single day. I urge you to think about this. I urge you to think about this. I urge you to think about these injustices, and how we can build a better future, and or and make a place of redemption. 400 years is a long time to have zero identity. So I hope this helps you understand some of the struggle, some of the Black struggle and the Black plight, and where the beginning of this lack of identity began from, the stripping of it, how, seeing this white Jesus has affected them, at least to some extent. I know we didn't get into the full effects today, but I strongly encourage you to go study that. There's a lot of writing materials on it. There's a lot of scholarship around it, and I think it's worth studying. So until next time, I thank you, for being here today, and I really hope you enjoyed this broadcast. Bye. Thank you guys for tuning in with us today. What a great show. I'm your host, Sharian, and this is the Will of Vessels. If you like what you hear, please be sure to subscribe to the Will of Vessels podcast, and please spread the word about us. We only ask that if you really like us, share the episodes. Share the episode you loved. Just share it. That's what we want. And also, you can always find us on @WillofVessels on Instagram. Please follow us also. And then the Will of Vessels on Facebook, and check us out and follow us for updates on new series and episodes. I hope you come back to visit us soon. For now, I won't say bye, but I'll say see you later. Thank you.